Hello and welcome to lecture number 25 of this series. And as you can see, the weather's got a little cooler in Athens at last, while still very pleasant. And today's topic will be a type of compound called a resinoid. So resinoids have a special sort of status in the perfumery, particularly in the factory where perfumes are compounded, because they are an absolute drag to use and to mix with other things. And the reason is they're typically very thick, treacly, sticky, dark compounds that are hard to spoon out because the stuff sticks to everything. They're hard to pour because it takes forever. They're hard to weigh because you can never get them off of the weighing vessel. And they're hard to mix because they take a long time to mix into this. So resinoids are not much liked by people who actually do the compounding or the mixing of perfumes. And you can usually find them in one corner of the perfume compounding floor. So you have all the beautiful drums of various, well-behaved materials like linalool or that sort of thing. And then over there in the corner, there's a part that has metal drums or sort of large jars containing the resinoids. And you can tell that you're dealing with resinoids for two reasons. One, typically, even in super squeaky clean fragrance factories, which they usually are, the resinoid section is not clean because it's just impossible to keep clean. Those things are too dark and too sticky. It's a little bit like when you have honey on your shelf at home. No matter how careful you are, unless you actually wash the jar of honey every time, there's always you have to put a little dish underneath because there's always honey sticking out. Sticking on the outside of the jar and to the bottom. And so resinoids are like that, only much worse. And I remember once I was visiting the factory of a very famous French company called Sinarome. And the factory was absolutely spotless and beautiful, everything neatly arranged and super clean and so on. And then they took me to the kitchen where, following a essentially secret recipe, Sinarome had been making a variety of bases that were largely composed of resinoids, among which ambrarome. Ambrarome is, I don't know how to describe it, but if they sold it as a perfume, I would buy it, and I think I would be satisfied with that for the rest of my life. Unfortunately, they don't sell it as a separate, as a customer product. They sell it only to perfumers, and it's now the recipe is owned by, the whole process is owned by Symrise in Germany. Anyway, ambrarome, they do, if I remember correctly, they made 2 or 3 different kinds, increasing in animality, I would describe it. Anyway, the kitchen for ambrarome in this spotless factory looked like an alchemist's kitchen from the 16th century, and it was all sort of tile in a slightly off-white or buff color, tiles like a kitchen, and it had various vessels sitting on top of heating sources, and there was brown resin literally everywhere, including on the ceiling and the walls, okay? So whoever was doing the mixing and cooking in there, according to this secret recipe, simply couldn't avoid putting it everywhere. The place smelled heavenly. It was really wonderful because the rest of the factory smelled like as typically fragrance factories smell. They smell either very little or of the strongest compound somebody's been using that particular week to make a batch of perfume. But that ambrarome kitchen smelled like you just basically arrived in heaven. So what are resinoids? Well, I had to do a little bit of background reading to prepare for this lecture, and I realized that I hadn't really quite understood the reason why they were called resinoids rather than resins. And I found out several facts that I was completely unaware of. The first one is that there's really two things that can be sticky, wonderful smelling, useful in perfumery materials. There's resins and there's gums. Now, they differ completely in chemistry. In the case of resins, the stickiness is due to very large hydrocarbons, so C20 and even larger, 20 carbons or more. Those things make for a very oily, thick solvent, essentially, in which the molecules that give it the smell are dissolved. Typically, those guys tend to harden as they are exposed to air. Often they do. And that is the reason then for the existence of amber, which is, as everybody knows, tree resin that has become, that hardened into a solid sort of transparent plastic many years, or indeed hundreds of thousands of years ago, trapping insects and so on. So those are the resins, properly tree resins. And then on the other hand, there's the gums. So incense, for example, is a gum. So gums are not made from hydrocarbons. They're made from sugars. They're polysaccharides. So they are kind of like honey, only much stickier and much more viscous. And in the gum itself, you can dissolve a variety of odorant molecules. The difference in practice between resinoids and gums is not huge. They're both behave in the same sort of way physically, but they are chemically quite different. So the first material I'm going to talk about today is Labdanum, which is the product of a plant called cistus, or in English rock rose, which is found in typically in the Eastern Mediterranean, so in Crete and the Greek islands. And the plant Latin name is Cistus ladanifer, meaning bearer of labdanum. And it's interesting because the way it was harvested in ancient times was by basically allowing animals to graze on the cistus plants and then combing off the resin that had become stuck to them as they did that. Now, more effective methods have been devised to collect the labdanum, but it's still basically a sticky material that's on the outside of the plant, so that if you walk among the cistus plants with some sort of large brush or something, you can pick up the resin that's stuck to them. It's an absolutely beautiful smell. I mean, in composition, it gives a soft, sweet, but non-vanillic, comfortable hum to the background of a fragrance, and it goes on forever and ever. I had some strips on the table here in which I dipped in labdanum literally 3 weeks ago, and they still, you can still really smell it. What's interesting is that at this concentration and by itself, it has very much the general feel of what people call boozy. So it's like a good whiskey or a good cognac. It's complicated, it's rich, it's actually quite edible, but that just means it's very comfortable. It has no aggressive aspect to it at all. And in fact, this is quite interesting because almost all of these materials have been at one time or another used as food flavorings. So this is a category of material which is not normally listed under the gourmand heading, but is actually quite close, or has been historically considered appetizing and edible. So the second material today is Opoponax, a famous perfumery fragrance material. Now the name Opoponax is a little bit weird because it's actually a sort of a mispronunciation of the name of a plant called Opoponax. And Panax is the origin of the word panacea. So Panax means something that cures all illnesses. But this is not extracted from the plant called Opoponax. It's from a plant called Comifera. And so to distinguish the real Opoponax from the perfumery Opoponax, they spelt it Opoponax. Now, what is the smell of? This is one of the strangest. First of all, it doesn't smell pleasant. Definitely has a galbanum angle to it, a green, intense, screechy green note to it. But it also has a linseed oil feel. It's very intense. It's interesting, this material has been used in many, many great fragrances. I believe in Guerlain's Habit Rouge, it's used extensively, and it's distinctly unpromising. The apart from the green and the slightly oily, woody, oily aspect, there's a definite dirty animalic background. But you wouldn't think it would be that interesting or important in perfumery. Now, with time, as I smell it now, what comes out is a rather weird combination, which is almost like chewing gum. It's a sort of minty. So you can see how this actually is an interesting dry down note, because this goes on essentially forever, but with what might be described as a top note, which is the minty aspect, would normally be carried by, let's say, menthol, which is very short-lived. It's an extremely strange smell. The third material is frankincense. Frankincense is very familiar. Usually comes in the form of a resin and little beads. Here in Greece, you can buy it in supermarkets. People use it at home. It's been used to create a fragrant smoke since forever, essentially. I personally find the smell of burning incense absolutely fantastic. I mean, it's just the most beautiful smell. It has something both sort of lung expanding and clean. To me, if it had a color, it would be blue. It would be a light blue, a sky blue. Now, it's interesting that the smell of burning incense can never be really replicated by incense extract. You never get that ultimate dryness that you get from the burning incense in incense extracts. And it's also important to remember that the different grades of incense vary enormously. I remember when I went to Oman, which is an absolutely beautiful country in the Gulf at the southern end. Omani incense is, I think, without question, the best in the world. And it is very clear and of a very even light yellow color. And it's so pure and such high quality that you can actually chew it like chewing gum. And it's very good for you as well. It's very good for, if you have any stomach problems, that'll fix it. And the smell of Omani incense is just out of this world. Now, I suspect, I'm not sure, but to me, this smells like Omani incense. Incense is very popular in niche fragrance. There are very few incense fragrances that really work, in my opinion. So the next material we come to is benzoin, and it comes from, I love the name, it comes from Siam, which is, I suppose, an old-fashioned way of saying the general area of Cambodia and Laos, and it's a 50% alcohol solution. Now, this is 50%, but it doesn't, as you can see, it doesn't exactly flow. I mean, you can tilt the bottle, and you can see it just barely moving. And this is the resin of a tree. Let me spread it out so you get more surface area. Now, this is such a good smell and so foody. that you really feel that there's no reason why this guy shouldn't be in the sort of gourmand category, because if somebody put a cake smelling of that, or a cookie smelling of this under my nose, I would happily eat it. It's used as indeed as a flavoring and as a medicine. Many of these compounds have strong antibacterial activities. And it makes sense because many of these secreted by the plants from which they come to prevent infections when there's a wound. The special thing about benzoin is that it is truly a magnificent smell. So what does it smell of? Well, it's got that warm cookie, sort of vanillic, but not quite. I mean, there's an element, it goes in that direction, but it's not just sweet. It's got also an upward sort of lift, which basically you think, oh, I could do something with that. So the fifth material we come to today is called fir balsam. And what did I say in the beginning of the lecture? These guys are a pain in the ass to use in a compounding lab. This one is so sticky and so gluey that it's almost impossible even to unscrew the cap. And whoa. Now, Spiros Drosopoulos, who selected this this array of materials as the sort of basic palette of the aspiring perfumer, described this to me in one of his emails as probably the best smell on earth. And I'm not one to disagree. It's actually really, really something. A truly sublime smell. This material may be a nightmare to work with, but it's certainly worth it because this is a smell that has, again, the very foody, warm Christmas pudding, chocolate chip cookie, baking, comfortable background smell. But layered on top of that, you have a sort of a continuous series of different odor facets that go up via benzoin type balsamic to resinous, sort of piney, clean, proper resin smells, like when you break a branch of pine, and all the way up to some sort of incense-like material. So this is really a perfumery accord in itself. So now the last material today is a material called Peru balsam. I don't believe it's particularly Peruvian, but I think it was traded from Peru, and it got the name from the last point of origin. It's amazing stuff. It's extracted from a tree called Myroxylon. Peru balsam is, in this particular series, a little bit of an outlier because even though it has, again, that very sweet, pleasant, reassuring sort of background fruity aspect, it's got a definite smoky feel to it, phenolic. And again, the phenols are antibacterials. I mean, famously, when Joseph Lister discovered that you could disinfect an operating room with phenol, he reduced the rate of infections after operations by a factor of 10 practically overnight, or even more than 10. This is definitely phenolic. It's also much more animalic in the background, also presumably because it contains cresols, which are related to phenols with an extra group. So this is kind of interesting because it has that biscuity cake, Christmas pudding aspect, but also a sort of animalic and a smoky aspect. So this is absolutely beautiful, beautiful smell. Very sticky. My hands are sticky from handling this, and I've been fairly careful apart from when I rubbed the benzoin. But there's simply no way you can avoid getting the stuff all over the place. Anyway, there's no harm done when you spill it, because that just means the place is going to smell totally wonderful for months to come.